Hi, everybody. Welcome to WNMU. Thank you for coming tonight. My name is Alexandra. I'm the Director of Cultural Affairs here at WNMU. I'd like to give a shout out to our WIL members that are here. Always very supportive. Thank you for coming. You know who you are. A couple of events coming up. We have on Thursday night, April 3rd, at the Fine Arts Center Theater, we have the New Mexico Gay Men's Chorus. This is a chorus of probably 30 or 40 gentlemen who are going to sing The Unbreakable Harvey Milk. So I encourage you all. It's $10, but nobody will be turned away for lack of funds. So I encourage everybody to join us over there on Thursday night at 7 p.m. And then on April 15th, we have another distinguished speaker coming, Betsy Gaines-Quammen, who is an author and historian who writes about the mythical West and its effects on our national identity. She's written about Mormons and all sorts of interesting Western phenomenon. Anyway, thank you again for coming, and we're extremely honored tonight to have Jay Coghlan from Nuclear Watch New Mexico and Archbishop of Santa Fe, John C. Wester, have come to speak with us tonight. Jay will speak first, and there will be a Q&A when they are finished, so have your questions ready. Thank you.
Okay. I don't think I need this, right? Because you got this?
Correct.
Okay. Turn it off. I like having the one with mobility, too. And I'll speak from here instead of the podium. And I speak somewhat commonly. I speak sometimes to a couple of hundred people, sometimes to 30, just like here. And when it's 30 like here, I want to end up quoting Shakespeare. It's, we brave few, you know, and we band of brothers. But of course, I quickly add and sisters. But you know, we brave band of brothers, sisters, working on what I actually think is the most serious issue in the world. Besides the fact that this human race needs enlightenment, full enlightenment, that's issue number one, I'll grant it, but issue number two at least is nuclear weapons. Obviously, it's not a light subject. I want to assure you in advance that I'm a fun guy. I'm not all morose about nuclear weapons. I have a great life, great partner, great outdoors, etc. So I'm very grateful for that, but I want to make sure that we're all around so that we can enjoy it. And I'm not going to get into my own personal history, which is, I don't know, unconventional, checkered, or whatever. But to me, you know, it's a real honor of a lifetime to be able to work on an issue that my highest hope is that we preserve the opportunity for the human race to fully realize itself. And that's kind of what the Archbishop is about. And we operate as a tag team. I think it's a good working relationship. I try to take you all through hell, and then he's going to lift you back up to heaven. So it works that way. So anyway, I wanted to impress you all with me by impressing upon you that this is at least the number two, if not the number one issue in the United States, in New Mexico, I'm going to get into that a little bit, and to the entire nation. So I'll probably speak for about 20 minutes, run through these slides. The Archbishop will speak for 20 minutes as well. We really encourage you on Q&A. That's actually what I enjoy the best, and also inherently, that's the best way for me to actually address to what particularly interests you because you asked the question. So again, encourage Q&A. So that's me. Enough about me. Let's see. Oh, I even got a clicker. This is working out good. Here we go. Okay, the first thing I wanted to do, I will mention just a couple of salient things about myself, which I grew up in a U.S. Army family. I'm a Army brat. I'm the first male in 5 generations to not be a U.S. Army officer. So I grew up, God, honor, and country, was supposed to go to West Point, et cetera, et cetera. And I grew up with deterrence, the word. This has been the one-word rationale for about $9 trillion spent to date on nuclear weapons in the U.S., with another $2 trillion coming. So the one-word pitch, sales pitch, ever since I was a kid, and I vividly remember the Cuban Missile Crisis, but it's all been about deterrence. So lately, I've been doing this work for more than 30 years, and there's ins and outs. So the latest in and out for me, or the latest approach I'm taking in my work, I want to puncture the notion of deterrence. And I think that's essential. And, in my own megalomaniacal way, I start thinking, how can I and how can we really influence Congress so that we can have real change? Well, what I'm coming up with for right now is we got to puncture the myth of deterrence. So that's why I have this as my first slide. The Nuclear Posture Review, as you can see in capital letters, that's something that every incoming president does. It's not required by law, but presidents have been doing that ever since Clinton. And of course, the main rationale for having this stockpile of some 4,000 weapons is, again, deterrence. But when you get into the actual implementation, and in this case, so a president conducts a nuclear posture review, and then within a year or two, the Pentagon follows with its employment strategy. And that's where the rubber hits the road. And in the 2024, so it's only a half year old right now, nuclear employment strategy, the Pentagon explicitly rejected minimal deterrence and say that we have to rely upon counterforce. And, these are terms used in nuclear war planning and jargon, et cetera, et cetera. But counterforce is essentially fighting a nuclear war. It's going after your adversary's military installations, and it's going after political leadership as well. Now, this won't surprise you. The world of nuclear weapons policy is an Alice in Wonderland world. Day is night, black is white. It's upside down. And the reason I say this is because what's called counter value is actually, I won't say a more humane policy, because there's absolutely nothing humane about nuclear weapons, but counter value is what is really deterrence, and that's where you have large cities targeted. And again, in this upside down world, that's actually better, because of the inherent characteristics of the truly widespread mass destruction that nuclear weapons cause. You're never not going to have collateral damage. You're never not going to have those big cities. And we're talking, I say this, it rolls off the tongue, but let us not be callous about it. Let us be aware. When I say collateral damage, we're talking millions and millions of human beings. First of all, being incinerated, and then the remainder dying a lingering death, due to radioactivity. So, the point I'm trying to drive home, the U.S. and also Russia, very much Russia, I'm I hasten to add, I'm a patriotic American. I love my country and think it's the best country in the world. And my proof of that is no other country could have invented rock and roll. Only the U.S. could possibly do that. But I really do blame my own country for what it's doing now and for having sold the American public this false bill of goods about deterrence. And it's always been about nuclear warfighting. And that's why we now have a $1.7 trillion so-called modernization program. And that's why we have thousands of weapons instead of just a few hundred. The what? Okay. So then I take it, then logically, I'm trying to take it to the next step. So not only is deterrence, it's not that it's false, it's a half-truth. And what we've always had is a hybrid of deterrence plus nuclear warfighting capabilities. But I repeat, that's why we have thousands of weapons instead of just the few hundred needed for minimal deterrence. Now, you, the American taxpayer, don't know this, but you are completely rebuilding U.S. nuclear forces. And the national labs and the production facilities are Department of Energy. The delivery systems are the Department of Defense. And again, it's roughly 1.7 trillion in all, except you wouldn't believe the cost increases that they have. If I wrote it down, it's like you can't make this up. But they'll have tenfold cost increases for warheads, for production plants, et cetera, et cetera. But the U.S. is building new facilities, new production facilities now, and some of them are already built. They're expected to be operational until the year 2080. So we are talking this modernization, I prefer to call it a nuclear weapons forever program. Going right down, all three legs of the triad, cruise missiles, et cetera, et cetera. So it becomes, deterrence itself becomes the threat. I'm going to back up one step. You end up with this endless cycle, because we're talking about nuclear warfighting capabilities. The planners need, call it a dynamic stockpile, where there's these constant modifications, and now we're even coming into new designs. And of course, the cynic in me would say that a lot of this is make work for both the laboratories and the production facilities. But we don't have a static stockpile. We're having this evolving stockpile, and we're getting into completely new designs that can't be tested because there's an international testing moratorium. Or alternatively, it could prompt the U.S. back into full-scale testing. And you can imagine the international proliferation consequences that would have. Every other country would follow suit. Every other nuclear weapons power would follow suit. So we're in this massive modernization, I prefer to say nuclear weapons forever program. Now, the deterrent, it's not only a threat because of it prompts new designs, new variants. You end up having a spiraling arms race, which we've already experienced once. But then not only that, we got a long history of accidents and miscalculations. And I point to those 4 H-bombs dropped on the coast of Spain. Do go to the Atomic Science Museum in Albuquerque. And they have 2 of those bomb cases that they recovered from the coast of Spain. And you see dents in the nose right there in the Atomic Science Museum in Albuquerque. The H-bomb that dropped on Goldsboro, North Carolina, hardly anybody knows about that. It had 5 arming steps on the way down. It went through 4. It was only a single arming step that kept a 1.2 megaton bomb from detonating in North Carolina. And the way that the winds are, et cetera, I assume the fallout pattern would have enveloped Washington, D.C., et cetera, et cetera. So you don't hear much about these accidents. But what really kind of gets me is where we've had the extreme good luck of having human judgment, and specifically Soviet Union human judgment, that averted Armageddon. And the first one was during the U.S. naval blockade of Cuba, and they started setting off depth charges against the Soviet sub, and there were 3 Soviet officers. U.S. didn't know this, but that Soviet sub had nuclear-armed torpedoes. And the 3 officers had to vote whether to fire a nuclear-armed torpedo on a U.S. destroyer or not. But if one person voted, one person could veto the whole thing. So anyway, 1 Soviet officer out of 3 kept that Soviet submarine from firing a nuclear-armed torpedo against a U.S. destroyer. And the Cuban Missile Crisis, being what it was at that time, would have undoubtedly, set off global Armageddon. Now, the second instance, and this one is very little known, but in 1983, a guy named Stanislav Petrov was a colonel in like the early warning system for the Soviet Union. And his radar screens started telling him that American intercontinental ballistic missiles were coming in. But there were only like half a dozen or so, and he thought that's odd. If the U.S. was really attacking us, it'd be 100 ICBMs coming in. So he did not report that up his chain of command. He just felt that something was wrong. And it later turned out that those Soviet radars picked up sunlight reflecting off of clouds as incoming American ICBMs. So here's the punchline. This is what I've been building up to. When I say that deterrence is the threat, and now we got artificial intelligence coming into command and control of nuclear weapons. Now what happens when AI, just strips out that human judgment that we already know of at least 2 cases saved the human race. So recommended reading, this is homework, and somehow I'm going to have to follow online with you all and quiz you all, but pop quiz on this stuff later. Recommended reading, Command and Control, Eric Schlosser, very popular about a decade ago. It's mostly about accidents in the United States. So recommend that. The Doomsday Machine by Daniel Ellsberg. And he, of course, is the famous Pentagon paper whistleblower. The Archbishop has talked to his son, in fact. But the biggest thing I got out of that book is once any nuclear war starts, how are you ever going to stop it? In other words, there's no such thing as a limited nuclear war. It's kind of all or nothing. Nuclear War by Annie Jacobson. That's a recent New York Times bestseller. It's fictional, but boy, she really, really did her homework. So if you want depressing bedside reading, go read that one. And then finally, this brilliant piece written by yours truly on how New Mexico is a nuclear weapons colony. I got some literature out on the table and back. This one's on bright yellow. Obviously, I can't go on too long about it, but one thing I want to point out, I don't know about you all in Silver City, but certainly around Santa Fe and Albuquerque, we're subjected to a pretty frequent stream of government propaganda economic propaganda about how, good the presence is of the nuclear weapons industry in New Mexico. So that's what we hear. Just a couple of quick facts. And I also like to show off what a nerd I can be. 1959 Census Bureau data shows New Mexico being 34th in per capita income. That's 1959. In 2022, Census Bureau says 46 in per capita income. On a separate economic issue, there's Los Alamos County, and Los Alamos County itself is the 11th richest county in the nation by median, by household median income. But it's also pretty much the richest county government in the nation as well, because of gross receipts taxes on Los Alamos. But the 6 counties surrounding Los Alamos County governments suffer a net economic loss because of cost of services provided to commuters that go to the lab. So anyway, you never hear this stuff. What you do hear is how beneficial economically the presence is. You don't hear, and by the way, that study that I just quoted from, the laboratory commissioned it, Lannel, and then tried to suppress it when this negative stuff came out. So, okay. That pretty alarmist headline I put up there. I have one caveat. Cuban Missile Crisis, that specific moment I was talking about, that Soviet sub, I think that was the most dangerous we've ever been. But I do want you to know we're back into a full-blown nuclear arms race. And in a lot of ways, it's a lot more unstable than it was in just like the classic bipolar structure. I like using the word bipolar. It's a pun. It's 2 countries, but it's also insane, and it was mutually assured destruction. It was mad. So the bipolar structure, crazy structure, the Soviet Union and the US, now we have multiple actors, and so it's like a chess game in 3 dimensions. So much more complicated that way. Increased chance of regional wars. India and Pakistan. My partner's been there, I've been there. They hate each other, and they're both nukes. And it scares the hell out of me. We got hyper and hypersonic weapons, which may not be deterrable. And again, I emphasize the growing danger of artificial intelligence. Here's the depressing part. I'm not going to dwell on it too much. The Archbishop and I were in New York City exactly a month ago. We were at the United Nations for the 3rd meeting of state parties to the nuclear weapons ban treaty. But sometimes I get the creeps sometimes walking around New York City and Washington, D.C., just knowing how it's targeted. And, since I have an inkling of what would happen. So here was the hell that I wanted to drag you all through ever so briefly. The Archbishop will take you back up to heaven. But there's the bad news of a nuclear war. Why is nuclear disarmament necessary? Now, that's probably a duh question. But I do want to quote Robert McNamara, who was Defense Secretary during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and known as a very sober man, former, CEO of Ford, automaker, before Kennedy brought him in. But he said, he was a so-called Harvard whiz kid. He said it was luck that prevented nuclear war. And we are not a perfect species here. Luck is not a long-term survival strategy. So we got to wise up about nuclear weapons. We're off in an arms race. I'm going to kind of just gloss over this stuff. I know it all too well. Encourage Q&A if you all have if you all can think of things. I do want to say, I went to Russia once. Well, I've been there a couple of times, but one time I did a fact sheet on plutonium pit production. I had a Russian professor at UNM translate it. I'm giving my talk in Russia, and I have a puzzled Russian audience, but it turned out this Russian UNM professor mistranslated pit as like a hole in the ground instead of like the pit of a peach. And when I talk plutonium pits, I'm talking pit of a peach, but there ain't nothing peachy about it. I know the guy. I know the FBI agent who led that raid, and he's a big anti-nuker. He lives in Boulder, Colorado. So that's just a point of interest. Exorbitant sums are being spent on pit production, and this is what is happening at the Los Alamos laboratory. And whatever you think or don't think, or whatever your view is of Los Alamos lab, obviously it has an incredible history story. And you probably saw Oppenheimer, etc. And I find it strange to watch it changing into being a nuclear weapons production facility instead of a laboratory. It's kind of a sea change. And that's where the big money is right now at Los Alamos. Stated here, in 2006, independent study concluded pits last at least a century. I asked then Senator Jeff Bingaman to require that study, and he successfully offered it as a floor amendment to the 2004 Defense Authorization Act, and it happened. There's at least 15,000 existing pits outside of Amarillo. And I've already alluded to this once. You can't test these new pits. And that's what the movie Oppenheimer was all about, was testing that first pit. You can't test them nowadays because of the international testing moratorium, or the worst alternative is U.S. tests. Former National Security Advisor to Trump openly advocated for that in it was August edition of Foreign Affairs. So, yeah. All right. Instead of pit production, there is so much waste buried up at the Los Alamos National Laboratory. That's not the best picture, but you can see that pit right there in the laboratory's largest dump. It's called Area G. There's no liner. That's direct in the dirt. And you can see how near the surface they're bringing it. They're probably going to put another layer, in fact, on top of that. And then they propose to cap and cover some 800,000 cubic yards of existing radioactive and toxic waste. And so, obviously, I'm going to argue that cleanup should be prioritized instead of unnecessary pit production. I'm drawing a deep breath because, well, it's getting a little delayed. I'm somewhat litigious, by the way, although I'm not an attorney myself. There's going to be a big fight over cleanup. I can see it coming, so I was kind of drawing my breath here thinking about it. Okay, where we stand now. So, on the first day in office, I've been in, I think, 4 lawsuits under the National Environmental Policy Act. Had a big win in January that is going to require a nationwide programmatic environmental impact statement on pit production. And, but they'll find a way to mess with that. So on his first day in office, Trump terminated NEPA Policy Act regulations, and which I have 4 lawsuits over with others as co-plaintiffs. So he terminated 1 layer of regulations.
Then he withdrew us from the Paris Climate Agreement, and I was stunned to hear the new EPA director saying that EPA's goal now is to make cars and home heating affordable. So, and climate change programs are gutted. And on second day in office, Trump also deleted all of this environmental justice stuff. And New Mexico, again, Census Bureau data, 50% Hispanic, 12% Native American, hence we're minority majority, and Trump just gutted all this environmental stuff, environmental justice. Big issue around Los Alamos. And again, Los Alamos County is the 11th richest county in the U.S., and some of the nation's poorest communities are contiguous to it, that being San Ildefonso and Santa Clara Pueblos. Okay, then I always get this question, and it's not doesn't have easy answers, and especially nowadays, but I do want to say that the small stuff is important. I was talking to congressional staff one time in Washington. I don't remember which office it was. But they told me somehow or another they have the Albuquerque Journal and New Mexican Express to them or something, and this was before internet. But they would count the letters to the editors. And if they saw a couple of letters to the editor on the same subject, they kind of extrapolated and say, oh, you know, all these many people are going to be concerned about this particular issue. So it kind of reinforced in my own mind that letters to the editor are important, op-eds, talk to family and friends. And, you know, I'm confident I came up with some stuff tonight that y'all didn't previously know. And at least in my view, these things should be further disseminated. People don't know, they don't understand that we're really in a new and very dangerous nuclear arms race. Support Trinity test downwinders. And obviously I know we're on the west side of the Rio Grande. On the east side of the Rio Grande, Archbishop John Wester and I have good friends in the Tularosa Basin. The Tularosa Basin downwinders, Tina Cordova, if you've heard of her, you know, and they've been advocating for just compensation because some folks in Arizona and Nevada get it, but our own victims here in New Mexico, when Trinity, by the way, was the dirtiest bomb of all, because it only burned up about 8% of its own plutonium, so it was a very dirty bomb. But the Archbishop held a mass a couple of years ago that the Trinity test, some of them, a dozen of them, came up, stood before the altar. Archbishop Wester offered them a healing ceremony of some kind. They were weeping. It was so moving, so very moving. We got the Trinity test and the atomic bombings coming up, the anniversaries. Archbishop John Wester and I are going for the 3rd year in a row, and I want you to feel sorry for us. It's extremely hot and humid in August in Japan. It's bad. I mean, it's seriously bad. There's currently a site-wide environmental impact statement ongoing. Comments are due April 10th. If you'd be so inclined, it'd be really nice to get people sending comments from around the state. But just go to my website right there, nukewatch.org. And then I consider, I know it seems like a long time away, but we got the midterm elections in November 2026. And, you know, I'm not in the business of telling you who and what to vote for, but boy, this one, you know, I'm starting to realize that I'm somewhat old, and I think I've lived through the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Civil Rights Movement, the Vietnam War, Iran-Contra, et cetera, et cetera. I think these are without question the most consequential times that we're living in right now. So I've made it almost 3/4 of a century. And it's this front edge that keeps moving on that, again, seems the most important and consequential. So, you know, the midterm elections are just going to be absolutely essential. And then I saved Gabe Vasquez last. I said his name right, didn't I? Yeah, okay, just making sure. I don't know. I've never met him. Obviously, I'm aware how the 2nd District down here swings. Democrat, Republican, swings a lot. And therefore, he's in a tenuous position. What's important to me is that he's on the Strategic Forces Subcommittee of the House Armed Services Committee. And, you know, there's a dual track in congressional legislation. That's when Congress actually legislates, which it doesn't do anymore. But there's authorization and there's actual appropriations. He's on authorization, and that Strategic Forces Subcommittee is what authorizes the money and also sets policy for the United States nuclear weapons program. So he's in a very good spot. I want to get to him somehow, but I'm encouraging you all to get to him. And the fact, also it's a sign that he's on armed services, because that's considered a plum position, and that is Democratic Party leadership doing what they can to make sure he gets reelected by putting him on a plum committee seat. So anyway, but we should be using that to our advantage. And with that, I think I've taken up a lot of time, and I just, not to put any pressure on the Archbishop, but he now has to come up and save our souls.
Well, good evening, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. I've been here now for 10 years, and New Mexico is my first time to Silver City, so it's a real joy. And I love the views coming over here. I came over 152. It's just beautiful, really, really nice. And Melanie, my executive assistant, was very wonderfully came with me and drove most of the way over the mountain and everything. So she did a great job. Thank you, Jay. It's been a pleasure to be associated with Jay. I count him as a dear friend now. We've known each other about 5 or 6 years, and we've been working together on this whole project of nuclear disarmament. We had a wonderful symposium at UNM on deterrence versus disarmament. We had the director of Los Alamos Labs was there, and we had SIG, the former director, and Tom Mason, and we had a State Department official, a dear friend of mine, Cardinal McElroy, came from then San Diego, now he's in DC, but he came to speak, and we had just a wonderful, Rich Wood, who's now with USC in Catholic Studies, but he was with UNM at the time. We just had a wonderful symposium. We met with Dr. Peary from Sandia, head of Sandia Labs, a few months ago, and we've had some wonderful conversations. So, before I met Jay, I used to sleep pretty well at night, and now not so much. But I want to make the point, though, that some people ask me, well, why would the Catholic Archbishop of Santa Fe be speaking so clearly and publicly against nuclear weapons? And I want to make it clear that I support our laboratories for the good work they do and could do. Many of my parishioners work either in Sandia or at Lanel, And I'm from San Francisco, so California, not far from Lawrence Livermore. So I know, I'm sure through connections, a lot of people work there. But our labs already do some very peaceful, good things, medical things, and they could do even more if we could ever get to that point where we had multilateral, verifiable nuclear disarmament worldwide. Because, and I asked Dr. Piri that when we met, I said, I'm curious, scientifically, are there ways to determine, to verify that states have indeed, disarmed? How do you know you wouldn't be bamboozled? And evidently there are, and there could be more. So I want to make that point right out, that I'm not against the labs. I'm just against nuclear arms. And I'm against the narratives that we've been given a lot, which, as Jay so beautifully pointed out, are not accurate. Some people ask me, well, why are you doing this personally? Well, personally, and Jay made mention of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So in 1962, I was coming home from grammar school, and I can still remember, and I don't know, I'm 74, but maybe you're not that age yet, but I can still remember looking up on Glenwood Avenue and thinking a plane that was flying low overhead was a Russian plane. So the folks, I think, tried to shield us pretty much, but you pick things up as a kid. And we lived literally across Skyline Boulevard where the Nike missile site was. In those days, that was a rather advanced system. Nowadays, it would be like a little pop gun compared to what we have today. But in any case, we felt threatened as a 12-year-old. I can still remember that. I remember what part of the block I was standing on. And so, and of course, I'm also personally involved because I was in Japan the first time in 2017 with then Cardinal Aveda and Bishop Steve Blair of happy memory. And I can still remember seeing those kids in the pictures, the museum there in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, attracted by the bright light. And we would all be attracted, but especially a child. And of course, unlike me, many, if not all of those children couldn't run home because they were killed. And so I do have a very personal connection to this important work. And as Jay said, I think it really is one of the most important things we can be about these days. I also have a connection because of the moral implications. As a pastor, I am very deeply concerned for the lives of all of us, for my people, and for the lives of those who work at Mantle and at Sandia. I'm concerned for all of us. So I think that there's a moral connection to all of this. Picking up on Jay's point, I said to Dr. Piri when we had that meeting, I said, I guess whether it be New York or DC or wherever you may be, I guess here in New Mexico we're sitting ducks. We'd be targeted first in a nuclear Armageddon. I guess we're in a pretty bad position. And Dr. Piri said, no, Archbishop, he said, actually we'd be the lucky ones. And after a few seconds I thought, oh, I see what you mean. The living will envy the dead. So it's clearly an important, urgent, and important issue. From a moral point of view, of course, for us as Catholics in our Catholic faith, our Catholic tradition, Pope Francis has ratcheted up immeasurably. In 1983, he's doing well, thanks be to God. In 1983, the USCCB issued a peace pastoral, which again I'm very much connected to because a dear friend of mine, the late Archbishop Quinn, was the president of the conference then. And then in the formation of this letter. And in that pastoral, the bishops and the Catholic bishops in the United States provided for deterrence. They spoke against nuclear weapons, but they said, however, we can understand where we need nuclear weapons for deterrence. And I've excised a large part of my talk because Jay handled that much better than I could. Besides, he wrote that part of my talk, so I figured he better hear it from the author than me. But so that was a given in 1983. Now, over 40 years later, well, actually, around the 40 years, almost 40 years, Pope Francis has ratcheted that up, that moral reality, because he said even possessing nuclear weapons is immoral. Even possessing nuclear weapons is immoral. And so that's, to my mind, a huge challenge to the human race to look at this question and no longer to see it as something that's acceptable, but indeed we're dealing with something that's immoral. And I think that's something that we need to flesh out. I was just recently in El Paso this past week, and Cardinal Fabio Baggio came out from the Dicastery for Integral Human Development. And he expressed something I was very interested in. He said, I'm very surprised that not more bishops, priests, Catholic lay leaders, moral theologians are not picking up on our church's Catholic social teaching. And I'm going to say a little bit more about this in a minute, but he said, I'm surprised that people don't see these issues as critical human, moral, religious issues. I think people kind of bifurcate and say, well, my religion's here and the rest of my life is here. But that's not true. It's integrated. And so we need to see more of an integration of these issues and recognizing that people of faith have something important to say about the morality of nuclear weapons. Sometimes I get the position, whether I'm working on immigration or climate disruption or now nuclear weapons, people say, well, you know, Archbishop, why don't you kind of mind your own business? You know, you stay in your sacristy and let us politicians take care of this. I find that a scary proposition if we're to leave all this just to the politicians. I have nothing against politicians, but this is something all of us have to be involved in because, frankly, we are all involved, whether we like it or not. Our tax dollars pay for nuclear weapons. We'd be the ones, if they're ever used, that would be hurt. And frankly, and I'll say in a minute later, people have already been harmed by nuclear weapons because of their development and deployment. So we have a lot to say about it, and we need to say a lot about it. I think it's very instructive, too, that, you know, Jay mentioned this, but I sometimes fantasize, and I don't know, you know, Annie Jacobson wrote a book that Jay mentioned on a nuclear scenario. Cormac McCarthy wrote, you know, The Road, maybe you saw it. I think it was a movie, it didn't do so well, but No Country for Old Men, I think, did much better as a movie. But The Road, these are, you know, people using their imaginations, and some of it's not just imagination. I mean, they use computers to say, what would it be like if there was a nuclear Armageddon and a full-out war between Russia and the United States and the nuclear aftermath? And so I kind of fantasize that. I don't know exactly, but I think to myself, every book that's ever written, you know, would be destroyed. There's enough firepower. It's nice having Jay here because he can, in the Q&A, correct me if I'm in my errors. But there's enough firepower in just one nuclear Triton submarine out of Archbishop Etchen's archdiocese in Seattle to destroy human civilization. What would that mean? Well, as I say, every book ever written would be gone. Every medical advance, penicillin, things like that, you name it. Every technological device developed, every philosophical or theological insight gained, every transportation mode we now take for granted. No communication, no hospitals, no first responders, no schools, no libraries, nothing. Human civilization is destroyed. We would need a new Alexander Fleming to invent penicillin, and a new Alexander Graham Bell to invent the telephone. We would need a new Carl Benz to invent the car, a new Wilbur and Orville Wright to invent the airplane, a new Charles Babbage to invent the computer. I presume there'd be some left who'd remember the invention of the wheel, but they wouldn't have much to do with it. As Albert Einstein said, I know not with what weapons World War III will be fought, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones. So you get the picture. As Reagan and Gorbachev said in 1985, a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. That's nice to say. But with over 13,000 nuclear weapons in the world today, there's no guarantee that they'll never happen. And as Jay so concisely and precisely pointed out, as long as we have them, frankly, it's bound to happen, either through intent or misunderstanding or terrorist activity, who knows. It's just impossible for me, anyway, to think it's not going to happen. So I think to myself, well, if I was talking to somebody on the plane or the bus, and they said to me, well, what are the moral reasons why you're against nuclear weapons? I think Jay has given us clearly some very strong, practical, logical, humane, obvious reasons why we should not have nuclear weapons. But I wanted to just kind of explore a little bit, just in my own mind, what would I say? What would be some things I would point to explain to that person why nuclear weapons are immoral? And I think the first thing I would say would be this, is that, well, because we're not God. That in my own faith tradition and so many more, God is the giver of life. And we as human beings have taken over godlike attributes, which for me is blasphemous. I came across a quote by Hunter Thompson, which I found interesting. He said that human beings are the only creatures on earth that claim a God, and the only thing that behaves like it hasn't got one. Very incisive quote, I thought. We are stewards of the gifts that God gives us. And morally, we believe, therefore, that we are the recipients of a gift, and as such, we need to be grateful and respectful of the gift. And we show our gratitude not by threatening to blow up the gift, but by taking care of the gift. And so I think that the story of Adam and Eve here for us is very archetypal, that when human beings try to become as God, they lose the Garden of Eden. If we try to become as God, we will lose our Garden of Eden. A second point that comes to me is the contrast. I think of the contrast between a nuclear weapon and human relationships. Nuclear weapons, I think, is quite interesting and perhaps more than just coincidental. That nuclear weapons exist in silos. They exist behind a shield of secrecy. You can't get near them. Guards and infrared and all kinds of technology, and it's top secret, etc. And yet, we know that God created us to be in right relationship with one another. That's a very important phrase for us and people of faith, right relationships. In the Hebrew and Christian scriptures, they're threaded through with this theme. And the late Walter Burkhardt, a favorite of mine, Jesuit priest, he wrote something I think that's quite beautiful. He said, "Those who read in the sacred text a surely personal, individualistic morality have not understood the Torah, have not sung the Psalms, have not been burned by the prophets, have not perceived the implications and the very burden of Jesus' message, and must inevitably play fast and loose with St. Paul. The social focus of God's book is evident on the first page. The song of creation is its overture. Our incredibly imaginative God did not have in mind isolated units, autonomous entities. God had in mind a people, a human family, a community of persons, a body genuinely one." And so nuclear weapons exist in silos, and if ever used, they would create a silo of emptiness, of despair. And so I think playing with those two themes from a moral point of view, looking at, frankly, any weapon of war, but most particularly nuclear weapons, destroy relationships, human beings, destroy the environment with which we are to have a positive relationship as stewards, hence Pope Francis's Laudato Si, that this whole notion of relationality is completely destroyed by nuclear weapons and in an extreme and unimaginable way. And so I think that's something that we should think about as well. From another point of view, from a moral point of view, sin is something that fragments, and grace is something that gathers together. Nuclear weapons, from our moral point of view, are the essence of sin. It's fragmenting, destructive, killing. It's grace that binds us together, that bonds us together in human relationships. I think the other moral point would be that our Lord, for us and Catholics, teaching that Jesus preached a gospel of peace. But in Islam, the Quran also promotes peace through its core values, insisting that peace is one of the names of God. And in Judaism, we see that loving your neighbor as yourself is one of the major tenets of their faith. The Shema prayer loving God with your whole heart and soul, and then loving your neighbor as yourself. Hinduism, the Vedas advise people to be peaceful in their daily lives and to explain how to achieve a peaceful life. In Buddhism, the non-injury of other things is a principal tenet in teaching. And his teachings also say that violence harms not only the person against whom the perpetrator is attacking, but harms the perpetrator as well. And so I think that that whole notion of major religions, minor religions, people who have no religion but have a love for humanity and creation, all have a constant theme of peace. And so again, from a moral point of view, when you're dealing with nuclear weapons, which can only be used in war, or by accident, but whose purpose is to be used in war and to destroy everything, clearly they must be banned from a moral point of view. A lot of talk, it's interesting, I've come in this work now, since I've met Jay, I'm now a member of Pax Christi, all kinds of doors have been opening up. But Bishop John Stowe of Lexington, Kentucky is now the bishop head of Pax Christi. And Pax Christi was very helpful to us in helping to promote our pastoral letter, Living in the Light of Christ's Peace, a conversation toward nuclear disarmament. And Pax Christi has been around for a long time. And they just celebrated 50 years and a little bit ago. And they've been traditionally talking about this whole theme of peace and the morality of war, etc. And inevitably what comes up is the just war theory. The just war theory came out of St. Augustine way back in the 300s. And then St. Thomas Aquinas refined it a bit. But it's something that in moral theology classes and moral teaching, people come up with this whole, to talk about the just war theory. There are many elements to it, but three elements that are particularly germane for our conversation tonight is that the just war theory teaches that there must be, for a just war, the probability of success. Another one they talk about is proportionality, that the response must not be greater than the instigation in the response. And then they also talk about civilian casualties, that you must provide for protecting innocent human beings, civilian casualties. You don't have to study this too long to realize that in all three of those, and other elements too, but particularly those three, there's no probability of success in an all-out nuclear war. Everyone's destroyed, as that quote from Reagan and Gorbachev. There's no proportionality whatsoever. This is pulling out all the stops. It's the maximum firepower. There's nothing like it. It's impossible to imagine what it would be like, and Jay gave us a hint of that, and it's terrifying. And that doesn't even talk about the 10 years of a nuclear winter. Frankly, most people would die of starvation in a nuclear reactor. It would be about 5 billion people would die of starvation because the sunlight would be deterred, and there'd be no plant life, there'd be no food. And again, that book, By the Road, rather graphically and sometimes horrifically describes what life would be like after a nuclear Armageddon. And of course, civilian casualties, well, billions of people would die, so there's no doubt about it. So I would go so far myself, personally, I'm not a theologian technically, but I would go so far as to say there's no such thing as a just war, period. With nuclear weapons, there's absolutely no such thing as a just war. Another moral principle that I would talking to my friend on the bus, by now my friend's either gotten off at the next stop or has perhaps fallen asleep, I don't know. But the next point I would bring up would be that in our Catholic teaching, we have a very strong pro-life stance, the dignity and the sanctity of the human being. And again, clearly what I've said thus far, nuclear weapons would destroy human beings, clearly, indiscriminately. And so just from a pro-life stance, this is something that's very critical, I think. One thing that Archbishop Wester and I are attempting to do, for a variety of reasons, we haven't had a chance to do it lately, but we did make one effort, and we were I won't say rebuffed, but it didn't go over. But I would like to make the nuclear disarmament part of the USCCB's pro-life platform, that this is a pro-life issue, and this is an issue that we must speak strongly about to counter the second nuclear arms race that we're now in, which Jay pointed out is arguably, and I think quite arguably, more dangerous than the first, particularly with hypersonic delivery systems, with artificial intelligence, and given the geopolitical situation we're living in today, I think accentuate that point. Another point, I think from a moral point of view, that cannot be overlooked is the amount of money that goes in to nuclear arms. Jay gave a brief overview. I have here a whole page of probably tedious statistics, but allow me to spare you just to say the amount of money involved in manufacturing nuclear weapons is enormous. It's beyond imagining. It's really, if you take the whole gamut from Oppenheimer in 45 to the present, the trillions and trillions of dollars and going into the future. And so that money obviously could be spent for medical, technological, civil infrastructure, educational means, social well-being, programs that could help. You know, here in New Mexico, we have children that go to bed every night hungry. We come in, you know, last so often in educational outcomes. You know, I drive through Espanola to the parishes and all, and there's clear, you know, throughout our state, there's clear pockets of large pockets of poverty. Sometimes people say, yeah, well, that money is really helping New Mexico. That's not true. And I'm sure that people here in the university who have studied this, and matter of fact, it probably, I would say, venture to say, if you studied it, my guess would be, it would even hurt the economy, like of Espanola, because they got to provide for people, but they're not getting input from those tax dollars. I admit that, you know, people living in Los Alamos County probably are doing pretty well, and I don't begrudge them that, but I'm just saying, in terms of that money helping New Mexico, that's not true. So I think that's another issue that, and Pope Francis again makes that point quite a bit. There's another interesting point too, a little bit more nuanced perhaps, but that is looking at the whole theory of a dominant culture or colonialism, doctrine of discovery, that kind of thinking. That if you think about it, the nuclear weapon states, of whom I believe there are 9, maybe except for North Korea, but they're well-to-do, developed countries. And so there's kind of a colonialism by those states that own nuclear weapons, it gives them a power and an influence that puts other states, other countries at a disadvantage. Not to mention the fact, of course, that the money that we're spending on these nuclear weapons could be used for people around the world and their need. And not to mention the fact that if the nuclear weapons were ever used, then those people would be injured and killed along with everybody else. So they're victims, if you will. They're being subservient to the dominant cultures, those cultures that have the resources, that have nuclear weapons. It's, I think, a form of modern-day colonialism. To date, Jay mentioned the TPNW. To date, there are 94 signatories, 94 countries that have signed the TPNW, the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, 73 of whom have ratified it as of March 7th of this year, so just last month or so. So those are current figures. So I think that this is a very hopeful sign that if we could get the countries, especially the nuclear arms countries, to sign it, that would be a step in the right direction and a step away from this sense of colonialism. I don't want to get political here, but you know, it seems to me that we're in kind of a nationalistic modality right now, looking at how the United States can be great and how we can kind of boost up our own selves with what I perceive to be a rather wanton and even cruel disregard for other people who are in need say for a PEPFAR money or USAID, whatever it may be. So I think that from a moral point of view, I think this is worthy of a deeper dive of how nuclear weapons are immoral, just from the point of view of the dominance that those countries with them have over other countries. The other point would be, of course, and Jay, you saw that picture of the pit. That is a pit and hole, that particular pit. The radiation poisoning that's taken place already since 1945 in New Mexico. I think this is the Tularosa Basin Downwinder Consortium, or the Trinity Downwinders, they're sometimes called. Tina Cordova has become a wonderful friend, and certainly I admire her greatly for her work in this regard. She herself has cancer in remission. She just found out about a year or two ago that her niece now has thyroid cancer. That's the 5th generation in her family with cancer here in New Mexico. And so she's seeking justice for the unknowing, the unwilling, and the uncompensated innocent victims of the July 16, 1945 Trinity test in Central America and South Central New Mexico. Socorro, Corizoso, Alamogordo, and the Mescalero Apache reservations suffer high rates of cancer and autoimmune diseases, and this is due to nuclear fallout and leaked radioactive waste. All the mines we've had in New Mexico have caused countless workers to be exposed to radiation and to suffer cancer. Sadly, as you know, Congress, we came pretty close actually a while ago, just a bit ago, but they still have failed to pass any bill that would give compensation to the Tularosa Basin downwinders, and that's a real tragedy, and I think a real unconscionable. I've already spoken to Pope Francis. I realize I'm going over time as well, but I think I've said that. So let me just come close to my conclusions, not quite the end yet, with a quote from President Eisenhower in April of 1953. I really like this quote. And again, here's a 5-star military commander, former president, saying this. Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired, signifies in the final sense a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. This world in arms is not spending money alone. It is spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, the hopes of its children. This is not a way of life at all in any true sense. Under the cloud of threatening war, it is humanity hanging from a cross of iron. Pretty good quote for Lent, I think. So just to say in closing, Jay mentioned at the beginning of March, we were back there at the UN. It was my second time. Jay's been there before. And I gave a little talk under the auspices of ICANN. As many talks are given, you're talking to the choir, of course, but just to promote from our point of view the TPNW, the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. We have formed, so I'm the Archbishop of Santa Fe, Archbishop Etchen with the Trident submarines in Seattle, then Bishop Shirahama from Hiroshima, and then Archbishop Nakamura from Nagasaki, and Archbishop Emeritus Takami from Nagasaki. We formed a partnership for a world without nuclear weapons. And so we want to, as Catholic dioceses, give voice to the importance of disarmament. And so we're speaking from dioceses that have developed, manufactured, and deployed the only 2 nuclear weapons used in war, the 2 dioceses that receive the brunt of that, and the current diocese, which has the Trident submarines. So we think that it's important for us to have a voice at the table because we're involved. We have a right to be at the table. And so I ask for your support, your prayers for our little partnership. We have a website, Partnership for World Without Nuclear Weapons, and we're inviting other Catholic entities and non-Catholic entities to join either as endorsing or sponsoring entities or partners. And it's just in embryonic stages, but it's growing and it's moving. We've got a couple of South Korean dioceses. When I was back in New York for the UN, I said Mass at the Dorothy Day Center down there, and so people from the Tribunal of South Korea approached me and asked if I would be their honorary chairman. They're affiliated with SPARC, which is a group there in South Korea, which is seeking compensation because there are about 40,000 South Koreans in Hiroshima and Nagasaki who were victims of the bombing. So you don't hear about that often, but they're anxious to have their voice heard. And so I said, yes, I would be willing to do that. And so I think that's an important thing, is our partnership. Secondly, just so you're aware of it, we're seeking on July 16th coming up to have a prayer service. Our Bishop Baldacchino here from the Las Cruces Diocese, where your university is located, Bishop Wall from Gallup, and myself. And we're going to invite other interfaith leaders to join us for a prayer service at the Trinity Test Site on July 16th to pray on the 80th anniversary of this important commemoration. So I'm not sure yet. We were working on it. I just talked to Alan 2 days ago, a friend of mine who runs our Catholic diocese, the conference, and it appears possible. It appears like it's going to happen. So we'll see. It may not. If not, then we'll do something outside the site. And then before that, on July 13th, I'm going to have a Mass at a nearby parish there, I think it's St. Francis, to commemorate the 80th anniversary of the test site. And then also, as Jay mentioned, in August of this year, we'll be going back for the commemoration. Cardinal McElroy of Washington, D.C. now, Cardinal Supich of Chicago, Archbishop Etchin and myself, and the bishops I mentioned from Japan, we will be gathered there. We're going to have Notre Dame and Northwestern University, other academics. We're going to have some workshops, talks, dialogues before and after the 6th and the 9th. And that promises to be a very important time. There'll be a lot of civic leaders, obviously. I think that's going to be a big commemoration. So again, my own it's always good to end with an action point. I would encourage you, first of all, to have, I don't know who all is looking online or the students that may be looking online, but I encourage especially young people who may not have a visceral connection with nuclear weapons because of the Cuban Missile Crisis, whatever. I encourage you, but all people, to engage the conversation and not to, I believe strongly that people of goodwill, if they talk honestly to learn, not just to make a point, but to learn, I believe people will come to the conclusion, yeah, we've got to get rid of these terrible things. I think it's also good, as Jay pointed out, to write our political representatives. I know firsthand, I met with Nancy Pelosi when she was Speaker the first time with Cardinal World on immigration matters, and the one point she made to us was, look, the Catholics you represent don't agree with you. And so if you want us politicians to vote in your favor, you better get them to agree, because we like votes. We want to see what's going on. So the more people that write, call, email politicians, the better, because that's what they listen to. To study the facts. There's so many ways to do that now online, to really become more. I've learned so much from Jay, from Nuke Watch New Mexico, and from others, just getting into this. Dr. Ira Helfand, for example, whom I admire greatly, learned so much about this that I just didn't know. Frankly, I just didn't think about nuclear weapons. I didn't care about them. I said, well, that's from the bygone era, only to discover that I was wrong. There are many groups you can join. I mentioned Pax Christi. There's also Back from the Brink, the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons, which is ICAN. There's so many others. And, especially here on campus, you may want to form your own group. Jay mentioned there's a high school student who's just a fine young man, and he was with us here in New Mexico. He started a group at his high school about nuclear weapons. He's got I think he might be president of the United States someday. He's very outgoing and started a group. So those of you on campus here, you might want to think about doing that. Looking into these other groups and then modeling yourselves after it and forming an on-campus group to talk about nuclear disarmament. At least to have the conversation and see where it leads. So anyway, that's basically it. Thank you very much. And now I know we're open to Q&A, and we'll have a little time for that, and happy to stay for that. So, Alexandra.
Oh, good. Thank you for being here. I'm curious what the status is regarding the production at Lanel. All I had heard about some concerns regarding the transmission line for the electricity that they're going to need for that production going through tribal lands, and I'm wondering where that's at now.
I couldn't hear the question well.
She's wondering about the product, what's going on at Lanel, and all the electricity lines are building. And
Right, because there was, I had seen some meetings, community meetings organized against that transmission line going through the tribal lands to go up to Lanel because they need so much more electricity.
My mic's working pretty good, right?
yeah.
Yeah, okay. Okay, what she's talking about is the Los Alamos lab claims it needs a third electrical transmission line, and it goes across this kind of large, both culturally sensitive and environmentally sensitive area southwest of Santa Fe that's in part BLM land and in part U.S. forest land. And of interest, the lab claims that need basically because of artificial intelligence. And I restate my fears about mixing AI and nuclear weapons. But this transmission line, I've been surprised about it. It's had kind of small environmental assessments, one by the National Nuclear Security Administration, who owns Los Alamos Lab, and the second by the Forest Service that has to grant right-of-way. Those two kind of lesser environmental reviews got 24,000 negative comments. And it's this mix of the regular white enviros, it's Hispanics, and it's Native Americans. So there's kind of this unusual coalition that's against it. And it's engendered some bitterness, I would even say. And some of the Pueblos, and mostly Tesuque, is taking quite a strong stance against it. So I don't know exactly where it's going to go. Of interest, in my presentation, I mentioned this new site-wide environmental impact statement that's happening for Los Alamos now. And it is relevant because one of the few good things they propose is solar arrays at the laboratory that could generate up to 158 megawatts, obviating the need for this electrical transmission line. So things are in flux, and I can obliquely say there might be litigation about it.
Is it a done deal that this production is going to happen at Lanel?
Okay, the question
Is
was,
it a done deal?
Is it a done deal? And I assume that narrowly you're talking about plutonium pit production. Yeah. No, it's not a done deal. Los Alamos produced its first, what they call war reserve pit, that actually goes into the stockpile. They produced it in September, last September. And of course, I'm going to be cynical about the laboratory, and I think I have every reason to be. The fact that they got it in September was at the end of fiscal year 2024. and they would have been in deep doo-doo had they not got one pit done. So I think they ginned up this one pit to make it by the end of fiscal year 2024. They're required by law to go to 30 pits per year. That date keeps slipping. Currently, it's 2028. Originally, it was supposed to be 2026. You have to understand, and you won't find this in written policy, but the real mission of Los Alamos National Laboratory is to get taxpayer money and spend it. And in that sense, the program has been a wicked success. So.
I share your concern about marrying AI with the nuclear weapon system. How would we ever know to what extent AI is in control? Would there be any public disclosure about the moment when control would be turned over to an AI system?
I assume everybody heard the question, and even I did. I don't think we would ever really know exactly. I mean, obviously, that would be classified. So I think that there will be this initial creep into AI command and control of nuclear weapons. And this is only my personal hunch, just because it always seems to be a race to the bottom. It'll end up being very substantial, if not complete control by AI. And obviously, I think the consequences could be literally catastrophic.
Thank you so much for being here. My question is, I have heard before about, the argument about the money coming to New Mexico. It's really the opposite. But can you help us understand a little bit more about the details, how money that's supposedly earmarked for the labs and its detrimental effects economically here?
You could speak to that. You got it.
Yeah. First of all, it is a tough argument, and I've always felt that in more than 30 years of activism, that my toughest problem was the threefold rationale of jobs, jobs, jobs. And that's what you get from the New Mexico congressional delegation. Now, obviously, what gets really difficult and maybe just too completely hypothetical and abstract is when you go, if you didn't have these nuclear weapons jobs, what would you have as an alternative? And you all are going to be pretty familiar with Senator Pete Domenici. And I went to see him one time as a courtesy call to tell him that the organization I was with was suing Los Alamos under the Clean Air Act. And the first thing that happened was his environmental staff jumped up and called us environmental radicals. And it took us 5 years, but we creamed the laboratory on that. We won that lawsuit. Why it's relevant is because Domenici, no matter what you thought of him, one positive attribute was his candor. And he volunteered that, first of all, he spent more than 50% of his time as a U.S. Senator on Department of Energy issues in New Mexico, which makes me question, who do you really represent? The nuclear weapons industry or New Mexicans? Then he went on to say, my number one priority is to get money to the Los Alamos and Sandia labs. Then he went, and the way I do that is through nuclear weapons programs, because 98 other senators won't argue with me. This is an indirect way of
pointing to the problem. If we didn't have nuclear weapons jobs, what would we have? I'm not sure. I don't know. But, you know, I've heard the nuclear weapons money referred to as political heroin in the state. And our congressional delegation is addicted. They are addicted to nuclear weapons money.
I think too, I really do think that if we could get to the point of nuclear disarmament, we would need them to have ways of verifying that countries are keeping their end of the bargain up. And Dr. Perry indicated, because of to me anyway, from a layman's point of view, he dumbed it down for me, but because the nature of isotopes and radiation and all that, it's different than a glass of water. They can tell, leaves a trail, etc. Secondly, I think another aspect of that economic question is that the people that can't afford to live in Los Alamos live in Española environs around there, so that county has to absorb their services and take care of them. So it's an added burden to that county that the county is not receiving direct money from the government for. So it's a misnomer. The way I read it anyway is that yes, the money's coming to New Mexico, specifically to the labs, but that money doesn't trickle down to the rest of New Mexico. So I think it's kind of a little card trick there, as I perceive it.
One quickie. The amount of money that the Department of Energy spends in New Mexico every year is roughly equal to the state's entire operating budget. And I find that amazing. When I say operating, that doesn't include Medicaid, okay, which, is not discretionary. But the DOE budget in the state of New Mexico is essentially the same as the state's entire budget, and leads me to pose the question, what good does that do regular New Mexicans? I don't see it.
I would like to refer everybody here to look up this form of energy called zero-point energy or gravity control energy. You can look it up online. It is infinite, it is clean, and it is free energy. And it will make all other forms of energy obsolete. And so it's having a revival right now. This is kind of a long story.
Do you have a question? Is there a question here?
No, it's not a question. I'm just suggesting that people look into this. It's called zero-point energy, and it's also called gravity control energy. It's free, it's infinite, and it's being suppressed by the fossil fuel industries because it will put them out of business. It will make them obsolete. It's the same kind of energy that is powering our space capsules to go to the moon and to go into outer space. They're not going on gasoline. That's not how they're run. They're run by this zero-point energy, gravity control energy.
Is this something you've heard of?
No.
No. Okay. I'm gonna move to a question. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you for that, though. Thank you.
Archbishop Wester, have you been involved with any of the other faith groups in New Mexico along this same line? Are they also sharing your concerns of those who are concerned about nuclear deterrence and all the other issues? And is there anything along those lines that you think also offers some avenue for discussion and widespread information about about this whole topic.
Thank you. I think you heard the question. Am I involved with other faith groups on this topic of nuclear disarmament? Yes. When I first came out the letter, I invited other major religions that I'm associated with in Albuquerque, and they gave endorsements to the letter. So they were clearly, immediately, and eagerly, the Episcopal Church, Lutheran Church, Presbyterian Church, First Church of Christ, I believe. I'm not exactly sure of that, but they were very much in favor of it. I have to say, though, that I gave a talk to interfaith. These were mainly ecumenical leaders, actually. And this is very important, I think, to our topic tonight. One of the ministers was not unsympathetic to what I was saying, but she said, to be honest with you, we have more important concerns. She was an African-American pastor, and she said, I'm more concerned with keeping my young men from being killed or being on drugs or shot by whatever. And so she said, that's a more important. So I think that spoke to the reality that we're dealing with in this issue, is that people, they're very polite. They don't disagree, at least ostensibly, but they're not that interested in it. I think we've either been lulled into a false sense of complacency by the deterrence our narrative. They say, well, as long as we've got our 5,500 weapons and Russia has their 6,000, we're safe. And as we've tried to point out, and Jay points out, that's just not true. And then finally, I would say, we're inviting other interfaith leaders to be with us for the prayer service on July 16th. We do believe strongly that that makes a stronger statement, that the more people, more faith leaders we get involved, that'll be. And my initial sense is, as I made brief reference to, most major religions, all major religions I know of, would be very much for this. Again, I think we do run into some who just say things are more important to them right now. And I think that deterrence argument has worked. It's worked since 1945, and it seems to be that I hear that from people very close to me in my day-to-day work, that, they say, well, most people say to me, Archbishop, don't be so naive. We need nuclear weapons, and Russia's not going to get rid of theirs. And Jay has a wonderful line. He says, I think it's more naive to think we can live with nuclear weapons than without them. So yeah, we're working on that, but it's a very good point you make.
Archbishop, I thought you were so courageous as the Archbishop, whose parishioners are in the Los Alamos area, to publish that pastoral letter 3 years ago. And Jay, you've given most of your life to working for nuclear disarmament. So thank you both. And I do have a question. It seems to me that as you describe deterrence, it's a statement that if you attack us, we'll commit suicide, and we'll take you with us and most of the rest of the world. Catholicism is opposed to suicide. The world has become more dangerous. The likelihood of an all-out nuclear war or accidental launch of nuclear weapons in both directions greater. Have we moved beyond the point where living in the light of Christ's peace means conversation and education? Is this such an urgent situation that more direct action is called for to step away from the immorality of violence?
Yeah, I agree 100%. Though for that to happen, we have to have leaders, world leaders, who are in a position to do just that. And at the present time, we're seeing the opposite. As Jay pointed out, the nuclear posture review of the United States, China wants parity by 2035. Now with the new alignment, it seems, that I perceive with the Ukraine war, it appears that Europe is going to be on its own nuclear arms race now. They're talking about beefing up their nuclear armaments. Clearly, Russia, Putin's been bragging about his hypersonic delivery systems. So what you see on the geopolitical stage is the exact opposite of that. I often fantasize, it is a fantasy, I guess, what would have happened after 9/11 if the President of the United States said, enough is enough. I'm calling a meeting of all major countries, world leaders, political leaders, civic leaders, business leaders, religious leaders, a summit, a world summit. Maybe the UN could sponsor it. Let's sit down. How can Christianity and Judaism and Islam, Russia, United States, China, North Korea, Iraq, how can we all somehow work something out here? And that takes real leadership. Secondly, and I hate to say this, but there's big money in nuclear weapons, huge money. There's big money in war. I remember when the first Iraq war, in those days fax machines were more prevalent, I got a fax about I should buy stock in some ammunition company, this is a great time. And I almost got sick. But so, we're fighting that military industrial complex. Are we going to have world leaders that have the guts and the prudence and the foresight and the virtue? I know David French wrote a piece in the New York Times not long ago, and in it he was talking about different things, but he said that our system of checks and balances is a good one, but it requires leaders of virtue to make it work. And I think that what we need throughout the world and in our own country, to be honest, in our own church, we need people of virtue. So whether that can ever happen, I don't know. But again, it gets back to us, I guess, to make it known that's what we want. I mean, if a majority of people say we want nuclear weapons gone, and if the political leaders say, well, I'm not going to get reelected unless we make this, that will do it. But whether we can get to that point soon, it doesn't look possible to me. I don't know, Jay, if you have any.
I was going to add, you brought up direct action, and Archbishop John doesn't know this, but he actually has some street cred on this issue. And it was just a month ago, we were in New York City, but there were Catholic workers that were the U.S. maintains its delegation in office building just directly across from the United Nations. So Catholic workers, for not the second year in a row, but it was the second UN meeting in a row, were going to blockade those offices. And we're in that little peace park just prior to the United Nations, which has the famous quote, Isaiah, beat your...
Swords and plowshares. Yeah.
I'm going to let him quote that. But anyway, so those, I think it was like 40 Catholic workers gathered there. And Archbishop Wester blessed them, communally blessed them. Oh, and it happened to be Ash Wednesday. Yeah. And they brought you ashes. Yeah. So you were putting the ash on these Catholic workers that then went and got arrested for trying to physically block the office building of the U.S. Very, very moving. I'm not Catholic, by the way, but and I was like this far taking some pictures of Archbishop John. So just a very moving thing. And if you don't know about Catholic workers, and I didn't until like within the last year, and Dorothy Day, recommended reading. And he gave mass down at their, their house. Or
Dorothy Day house,
Lower East
the house
Side.
where she died.
Yeah.
We went up to her room where she died, and it was a very moving thing.
Yeah.
It's something that we all have to make our own decisions on, several of those got arrested that day. I gave them a blessing, and you have to decide I think this room, we need everybody. We need prophets. We need those who are willing to be agitators, I better not say his name, but I know a friend of mine was giving a talk, and he said that, he said we have to agitate. I know that could be a dirty word for some people, but We live in a democracy, and people have a right to make their voice heard, and should be respected. We're not going to all agree, but I think that that's the point of the conversation. If enough people enter the conversation and get involved, then I think it'll make a difference. Clearly, the fact that Pope Francis said that nuclear weapons are immoral made a difference. Now there's only one Pope, so but there's a lot of us. So I think I'm waiting for people to get on the bandwagon and kind of back the Pope up on that.
Good trouble. Making good trouble.
Making good trouble. That's right. Yeah, that's making good trouble. That's the view. I remember a friend of mine. He passed away, Louis Vitale, Franciscan in San Francisco, and he would go to Nevada and get arrested on the nuclear site. He would trespass on the nuclear weapons sites to protest nuclear weapons, and he got arrested so much that the judge got to know him. He said, "Oh, Father Louis, you're back." And I'll just tell you real quickly, but that was his decision. He'd get arrested, he'd be in jail for 6 months. He would do ministry in jail. He'd pray with the prisoners and all that. And so that was his decision. I mean, I feel for me that I am the Archbishop of Santa Fe, so I can't do that and be in jail at the same time. So right now it seems God wants me where I am. Plus, I need to keep lines open when I can't talk to. As Archbishop, I have an entree that I don't want to lose. If I start getting arrested, I would lose that. But Lou, just to quickly, he said his aunt was 100 years old. So before he went to jail, every time he would have a little lunch in San Francisco, there, Washington Square. He said, I was the auxiliary bishop then. He said, John, would you mind going to this lunch with me? Because my aunt thinks I'm a criminal. And I want you to sit next to her. She's 100 years old. She's hard of hearing. And let her know that I'm not a criminal. I said, sure, Louis, I'll help you. So I was sitting at lunch there, and I said, how do you do? Nice to meet you. And my nephew's a criminal. No, Mrs. I forgot her name. I said, no, we admire him. He's a prophet. He's against nuclear weapons. This is good. He's a criminal. No matter what I said, So Louis looked down. How's it going? Not good. You're a criminal. So some of us are called to be criminals. Some of us are called to give speeches. You have to do what you think is what God's calling you to do. But I want to emphasize, I really do believe more and more that if more of us got involved in this and started bringing this conversation up, that it would make a difference. There was a book written years ago, I forget now, I'll have to look it up, called The 100th Monkey. And it was a sociology. You remember that book? I think I have it in my library. I think it was done by a sociologist. What does it take in a democracy for an idea for a spark to be lit and for people to run with it? I think it had to do with the principle of the 100th. When the 100th person catches on, then it takes off. But you got to get to 100. I'm probably not presenting it properly, but it was something like that. So you have to have confidence. You can't be discouraged. You have to have hope. This is the Jubilee year of hope. You have to feel that my little part's going to make a difference, even if I don't live long enough to see it. Maybe I'm the 58th monkey, or the 62nd monkey, or the 80th monkey. But someone's got to be that number in order to reach to 100. So maybe we're getting close. Who knows?
We're going to take one more question. Archbishop has to get on the road, so.
Well, this is a nice segue to what I was about to say. And just as a point of fact, research shows that 3.5% of a population hitting the streets in civil disobedience can change the government. For us, that would be about 11 million people. So that's what I'm working on. Let's get 11 million people in the streets and change the situation. This is specifically, and thank you both for coming. I think everyone said that, and I certainly appreciate you being here. I'm not surprised, Archbishop, that there were people complaining about the lack of attention from Catholics to certain social justice issues. There's been a decline in the awareness and the teaching of that. I've had 16 years of Catholic education. I'm a practicing Catholic, so I had to take my theology and my ethics and so forth, and I felt very well grounded when I graduated. But I see, and I'm going to be critical here, a lack of leadership from our Catholic clergy, and especially the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops. I feel like they're not speaking out enough, and they're not putting their bodies on the line. And I realize that not all of them can, as you said, but you in a position as being an archbishop, and knowing that the Catholics are a powerful voting bloc and are really responsible in a large part for bringing the current administration back into play again. And we're really responsible in helping the administration the first time around. So here we are with this lack of understanding of social issues. So why isn't it that an archbishop can say to the pastors of parishes, you need to speak to social issues from the podium if people aren't coming to social justice classes that aren't being offered? Why aren't these issues being spoken to for the people who do show up to church on Sunday from the podium, so that people can be educated about what the real issues are for the radical Catholic faith, which is really what it is when you boil down to it? And there's so many people, even in my own parish, that there's a huge division, because many of them were scoffing and complaining about the issues surrounding the last election in November, saying that if you voted for one side, you were being against the Catholic Church. So there's a real problem with misunderstanding. And because we have a huge voting bloc, I don't understand why this isn't being pushed by the bishops and the archbishops from the podium. What are the social justice issues? How are they important for all of us? Not just nuclear disarmament, but certainly rights of Palestinians, immigration. And I know that the Catholic bishops came out with their condemnation, but what's the follow-through on that?
Let's hear an answer from you.
Well, thank you very much for that. I really appreciate it. And I'd like to take you home with me. Could you talk to... I'd say a couple of things. Your point is well taken. We've long called Catholic social teaching the best kept secret in the Catholic Church. And I made reference briefly to Cardinal Fabio Baggio, who flew all the way out from Rome to be at our conference on immigration in El Paso last week. And he said the same thing. I don't understand why this Catholic social teaching is not promulgated more in the Catholic Church. And I recall when I was bishop in Salt Lake City, I got now Cardinal McElroy to come out and talk to all the priests, because I said the priests they won't engage the topic. And so Bob came out and gave a beautiful day's talks on the Catholic social teaching of the Church. He has a PhD in moral theology from the Gregorian University in Rome, and a PhD in political science from Stanford University, and an MA from Harvard in theology. And so there's no one better positioned academically, certainly, to give such a talk. So, but I had to get him to do it. I think part of it is human nature. Priests don't want to, they don't like confrontation. They don't want to rock the boat. And again, in my fantasy world, pray God never happen, I see nuclear weapons coming at us and thinking to myself before the hits, we should have rocked the boat more. We didn't rock the boat enough. I think of immigrants now, living in the shadows, being forced, they can't go to doctors or hospitals. If you go to a church now, ICE could now legally come in and arrest people. I mean, we should be, the USCCB did give an answer. I felt it was tepid. And I think that, and I know there are many things to think of. Now, at the Cathedral of St. Francis in Santa Fe, I do what you just said, I think, as I'm hearing you. I try to speak to the issues. So I'm praying for immigrants. I'm praying for those who've lost their jobs suddenly and who are now left without a paycheck. Those are the issues, because the Catholic social teaching speaks about the dignity of the worker, the dignity of work, the sanctity of human life, the common good. These are all issues you can speak to. I think some are afraid of losing donors, frankly. We talked about this just back in El Paso. I gave a little talk, and we all had little talks we gave. But I brought up the point. I said, at what point do we stop? Why do we stop at a certain line? Why don't we go? But there does have to be, though, I think, a strategy. You just can't go out and say things because it makes you feel better and you get it off your chest. I think we have to be strategic. So you want to say things in such a way that probably you're going to lose some people, but try not to lose too many. You know, so you want to do it in a way that's not compromising the issue, but at the same time is strategic. So I think those things have to be factored in as well. As I mentioned a little bit in my talk, I can call the senators in New Mexico and they'll talk to me. I can call Javier Martinez, the Speaker of the House, he'll talk to me. If I start doing certain things that would be politically disadvantageous for them to be associated with me. And so even Jay and I actually, it was personal, you know, in a way, but when Jay and I started working, Jay is a very sensitive and wonderful human being, as you probably have guessed. But he was afraid. He said, well, don't mention my name, you know. He was afraid that if he was associated with me, it would strategically lessen my voice in certain circles. We've overcome that fear. We don't worry about that, as you can tell. But so there is that element as well. So I think it's a combination of fear, of thinking what's strategically most effective, and also there's a real conservative element, at least in the Catholic Church, that I'm perceiving today. That I don't know if I was hiding my head in the sand before, but I didn't really see it till I came here to New Mexico. I think it was just kind of burgeoning. But a lot of, I think I could say that I'm not just blanketing, condemning conservatives. Whether you're conservative or liberal, I don't really care. It's, you know, are you thoughtful? Is there a reason for what you say? Back up, please, what you're saying from Scripture, from moral theology, etc. So I'm not saying that, but I do think, I would say this, to refine that point, that there's kind of a movement, I would see, at least in some circles in the Catholic Church, to stick to liturgy, to stay in the sacristy and out of the public square, put it that way. That's not the gospel. That's not Matthew 25. That's not Catholic social teaching. That's not Pope Francis. Pope Francis has clearly said that the Catholic Church has to be out there for immigrants, for people in the peripheries, for people in the LGBTQ community, for people who are persecuted. You know, I participated in a protest in Albuquerque for the Gazans, and I was prepared to be called an anti-Semite because of it. But I felt that the issue, as you talk about, is so important. You know, now about 50,000 innocent men, women, and children have been wiped off the face of the earth. I think it's what do you call it? You know, genocide. So anyway, this is a tough one. It's a tough question that you raise, but I think we have to meet the moment. And I'm glad you raised it, and it encourages me to hear people say what you said.
Thank you very much.